Welcome to the Mendeln Infinimist build. This is a Mendeln or Ring of Mendeln focused version of the Shadow Summonmancer that's already on max roll, whereas that build is seeking to empower your minions as strongly as possible as far as your Paragon boards and gear etc. can carry you. This build accepts the fact that minions at this point in the game sadly cannot truly carry the weight of doing our damage, so instead we're going to rely on the Ring of Mendeln. On top of that, we're going to swap over our Paragon and the rest of our stats so we can properly scale the Necromancer's damage, which is what the Ring of Mendeln actually scales off of. Luckily for us, in the most recent patches, while they haven't significantly buffed our minions' damage or ability to apply that damage, what they have done is drastically reduced their chances of getting one-shot by various AoE damage types. And even with minimal investment, which you'll see later on in our Paragon board and in our stats and skill tree, are able to really survive a hit. So what I have for you here, and you can check the timestamps down below, feel free to skip around the video, check out exactly what you want to see. I will be updating the max roll guide with this variant and kind of advertising that the variant is there, and you should check it out if you've been looking for a more Mendeln focused version of the Shadow Summoner that is still relying on your pets to deal with tanking and general AoE and crowd control, but you're looking to really output some good damage. But before you click on anything, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done it already. I think something like 30% of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed to the channel, and it's such an important way to get YouTube to know that they want to push this out to the algorithm and get the rest of these super nerdy Necromancer Priests of Rathma out on YouTube to come check out the video. But what I'll have for you is the skill tree, our gear and aspects, as well as our Paragon board and Book of the Dead, so you can start piloting this build if you want to. Feel free to pause at any of those points in the video and check them out. I'll also have a max roll build planner down below that you can click on the link and be able to see before the actual guide is updated. On top of all that, while we're actually going through the video, I'll continue to include actual gameplay up in the top left corner just so you can have that visual representation to understand what we're talking about as we're going, and hopefully get a little bit more entertainment out of just staring at me spout off all the different stats that you could read on the screen yourself. But without further ado, let's go ahead and break down all the stats that you need to be able to play the Mendeln Infinimist Summoner. So we are trying to actually rely on shadow damage, actually rely on corpse explosion damage, and then in addition to that, Shadow Blight proccing with decay. So we're using Reap. Reap is obviously a great tool. It generates a corpse on demand, which is its most important part, but also that damage reduction whenever you use it is super great for helping to keep us alive. Then we come down here, only 3 points into Hued Flesh, not picking up anything else. Coming down to the next node, Blood Mist. Blood Mist generates corpses, picking up Skeletal Warrior Mastery, and then 3 points into Fueled by Death as a great damage multiplier, and then picking up Corpse Explosion and maxing it and using Blighted Corpse Explosion. In the next node, we're using Decrepify with Abhorrent Decrepify, 3 points into Amplified Damage, and then the 3 points into Skeletal Mage Mastery so that they get that little bit of survivability. This is mostly just for survivability. Their damage basically doesn't matter on the build. Picking up Corpse Tendrils and being able to apply Vulnerable with it. We're spamming this whenever possible, and since we have Abhorrent Decrepify up, and that actually triggers off the thorns from our minions, all of our cooldowns are basically off the moment that we walk into a fight, so just permanently spamming this gets us the most damage possible, the most survivability possible. It's really important to basically have this thing on cooldown 100% of the time. The 3 points in Necrotic Carapace are kind of like, maybe not. The Reapers generating corpses does trigger this for us, so we are able to generally maintain Fortify throughout the entirety of the dungeon. And I noticed that since we're able to generate like near permanent barrier from Bone Storm and Shielding Storm, having Fortify as an additional 10% damage reduction just to be able to make that barrier last longer also seems like a really good investment for these points. And then 3 points into Reaper's Pursuit for pseudo mobility, 3 points into Crippling Darkness to be able to apply really good amounts of stagger to boss very effectively, and then a 3-second stun, even if it's just based off the lucky hit of Corpse Explosion, is good enough to kind of fill in the gaps when any of our other crowd controls might be either on cooldown or didn't hit that target yet. And then the 3 points into Gloom. You'll notice I'm not putting the 3 points into Terror. Kind of think that Terror is a little bit of a trap. And then down into your last node, obviously Bone Storm picking up all the way to Supreme Bone Storm, the 3 points into Inspiring Leader to get that increased attack speed for your minions, and then 3 points into Death's Defense. Hellbent Commander doesn't work with Mendeln, so we don't really worry about that. And then I think having at least 1 point into Bonded Essence is nice, just so that you can get that added bonus heal at the end end of the timer whenever you use the Skeletal Priest. And then obviously we're using Shadow Blight. Just remember that Shadow Blight works as a 1.1 multiplier whenever we've dealt shadow damage to the target for us and our minions and the Mendeln ring. And then on top of that, the Shadow Blight instant damage, while it only does 22% weapon damage, can crit and is increased by decay on our aspects as well. It does a huge amount of damage for us. And then the focus on the stats here. We're looking to stack as much survivability and damage as possible. So crit chance, lucky hit chance, crit damage, vulnerable damage. All of our minions are going to gain 30% of these, but we're also going to scale Mendeln damage by 100% of all of these bonus stats, and then literally as much lucky hit as you can toss onto the build, as much damage reduction, etc. So for the helmet, this is where we're putting our disobedience. You would like to have maximum life, lucky hit with barrier, armor, and cooldown reduction. Crowd control duration is also pretty decent. All stats is okay, but you're starting to get less and less bang for your buck with those stats. For the armor, damage reduction, damage reduction, damage reduction. I would also like to have maximum life as opposed to damage reduction from distant tier probably. And then this is where I'm choosing to put Blood Getters to get the +2 to Skeletal Warriors. Howl from Below are not necessary for the build, but it has huge lucky hit chance, great corpse skill, attack speed, so it's easier to resummon your monsters as well as cast Corpse Explosion. The 2 different lucky hit chance for CC just kind of keeps us alive longer, and then the ability to basically pull your corpses with you makes the next fight altogether that much easier, and also makes it a lot more efficient to be able to stack corpses onto bosses, especially when they move around. On the pants, armor, damage reduction, maximum life, all of the good stats there. And then this is where we're putting Shielding Storm. Shielding Storm is absolutely required for the build, absolutely nutty. On top of that, it generates our barrier for the barrier lucky hit bonuses on the rest of our gear. For the boots, these are trash boots. It's where I'm choosing to put Explosive Mist. I would want movement speed, corpse tendrils, and then there's a couple different stats that you could put here. Dodge chance is pretty decent. Definitely corpse tendrils, definitely movement speed, possibly movement speed after killing an elite as well. For the wand, you want vulnerable, crit, intelligence. I have additive damage to monsters affected by shadow damage, so it's not terrible. It's a decent little source of additive damage here. And then this is where we're putting Grasping Veins. For the amulet, I think there's a lot of different options here. Gloom isn't super important for the build, but I just happen to have Gloom on here. And then total armor, lucky hit chance, and then damage reduction as much as you could put on it. And then this is where we're slotting in Blighted for that huge amount of multiplicative damage, which helps Mendeln. It doesn't matter where your hearts go, but we are using Decrepit in this slot. The interesting thing about Decrepit is that I would really love to be able to cast Decrepify, because that will engage your skeletons to be able to go attack sooner, as well as being able to apply all of the bonuses and the cooldown reduction and the damage bonuses that we would want at range rather than having to be in melee range all the time. But since it's an Infinimist based build, you can kind of assume that you're in melee range all of the time, but I would still like to be able to proactively cast it, and on non-season you'll have to. For the rings, basically lucky hit chance, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, maximum life, all of these are really good stats here. This is where I'm choosing to put decay, so we get that huge multiplier on our Shadow Blight damage, able to stack a ton of damage while we're waiting for Mendeln to proc, especially against bosses in higher nightmare dungeons. And then this is where I'm putting the Sacrilegious Heart. And then obviously the Ring of Mendeln. Not a lot to say about this. You obviously want to prioritize lucky hit chance, minion attack speed, and minion life. The thorns damage really doesn't matter. And then this is where I'm putting the Barber. There are a couple different options that you could use for hearts. I think that the Barber is by far the best one. It takes all your damage and turns it into explosive crit damage. And then we ended up on a focus. So obviously we want to fit the ultimate shadow somewhere into this build, so that Bone Storm does shadow damage and applies a shadow dot to be able to proc Shadow Blight as often as possible. But I was messing around with the shield. I was messing around with Lidless Wall. I think in lower nightmare dungeons, you could probably toss on a Lidless Wall and then use that for a bit of speed farming. And ultimately, I think you need Ultimate Shadow on the build, so it would be really hard for me to say, like, yes, you can remove an aspect here to be able to use a shield. Maybe you swap off from Howl from Below and you just use some regular gloves and move Ultimate Shadow to that. And then onto the shield, you could put Might Aura for additional damage reduction. That would probably be a great option. But the cooldown reduction, getting more cooldown reduction, lucky hit chance, and the lucky hit chance with barrier here is obviously disgusting. Crit chance would also be really nice. For the Book of the Dead, we are using Reapers to generate corpses. It just turns out you need as many corpses as you can get at any given time, regardless of the content. So I think this is like an obvious choice here. Bare minimum, if you wanted to use the Cold Mages and continue to rely on that crowd control that they can generate from you for the chill and the frozen, you obviously wanted to make it so that they're applying vulnerable. That's not super important since we have corpse tendrils up all the time, But let's say you're walking into a fight and they don't generate a corpse somehow. This is a secondary or auxiliary option to be able to generate vulnerable. But obviously a Shadow Mage is going to be able to proc our Shadow Blight for us a lot more often, probably attacking so that every 4th missile is in a secondary attack. Their damage isn't super important, proccing Shadow Blight is. And then for the Paragon boards, I'm going to have like perfect Paragon boards in the variant when I get that update out to it. Obviously I'm not level 100 yet, so I don't have all of my points, but in the starter board, we're picking up Amplify, really good to get that 1.1 for us and our minions, as well as increasing all of these generally good nodes for us. Always remember, and if you haven't seen my video, I guess I'll link to it somewhere around here. Minions gain 30% of the bonuses that the Necromancer would gain, but they gain 100% of bonuses that say the minions would gain them. So here, increasing our damage by 18% means that they're only getting 30% of that. And then the armor is just really good for keeping us alive, which is probably the most important thing to do on any build. Then into the Scent of Death board, we are picking up Ruin. We're also picking up Corrective here, and then we're putting Control into the board here. Great amount of damage, great amount of multipliers. We're staggering bosses super easily, so we're able to get a huge amount of additional bonus out of this glyph once that happens on them. Then I would recommend building over into Cult Leader immediately. We're only going to pick up the glyph, and we're eventually going to build up into Armorclad from a different board, but you want to be able to get these bonuses very easily as opposed to putting it as your last board and then maybe not able to reach the stat bonuses. And then we're putting Dead Razor into the board. I actually do not have a rank 15 Dead Razor yet. We are still leveling it up. So this is going to get us like a total of like 35 or more damage reduction for our minions. We obviously want to pick up the additional damage reduction here and the damage reduction nodes. We don't care about minion damage at all. We come up into Puppeteer for more attack speed on the minions. That's why we pick up these nodes here. Later on, we are going to build into Armorclad and max it out because that gets us armor and maximum life for their better survivability. But you don't care about Cult Leader. You don't care about getting their damage. You don't care about their resistances until they do an overhaul on how resistances work in the game in general. Then we want to build up into Flesh Eater, picking up Stifle, and then here's where we're putting Essence. That critical strike damage is great for us for Mendeln. They get 30% of it, and we get that huge multiplier when the target isn't healthy any longer. From here, we then build over into Bloodbath just so we can pick up the Exploit glyph for the biggest dexterity bonus that we can possible here. We don't care about this damage for Fortify, we just have to build into it, and then that's where we end up building down into here. So hopefully that gives you like a pretty good idea of what the boards look like right now, getting a little bit of that survivability for our minions, but mostly focusing on the Necromancer's damage because that's what scales men down. There we go. I'm actually pretty happy with the build. I'm going to continue to tinker with it. You might see some optimizations once it's updated in Maxroll, hopefully within the upcoming week. And I'm going to be advertising it a bit more because I know people have been looking for a Mendeln build. And I think that this one kind of bridges the gap between being a Shadowmancer, being a Shadow Summoner, and then having a Mendeln version of it where you're focusing on that damage without needing to go like straight into only the ring is the only thing doing damage for us. But again, I really hope that this helps. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. It would really help me out, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.